Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and tell us what kind of stories you would love to hear next. And subscribe, so you'll be here when the next story wakes. Now, let's begin. I never planned to be the kind of person who learns the names houses whisper in the dark. When I was younger, the idea of staying somewhere that held you accountable to an old ledger sounded like a plot point from a movie, neat, finite, tidy, but some nights change you not by spectacle but by drift, by the way a place leans on your memory until you do what it asks out of habit rather than fear. It was a Wednesday when Caleb texted, 3 words, nothing soft, Ent's house, empty all month, crash, and for reasons that felt as flimsy and as necessary as cigarette smoke I said yes. The house sat on the sort of suburban cul-de-sac where lawns try too hard and porches keep their gazes polite. Under the sodium glow of the streetlight the clapboard looked older and more obliging than I expected, as if it had learned to wait for guests and to keep them while they caught their breath. Inside there was the thin scent of lemon polish and old paper, a kind of domestic incense that announces a history but not the detail of it. A grandfather clock loomed in the hall, carved faces and floral scrollwork elaborately apologetic for the passage of time, and when I stepped in the first oddity was that its pendulum hung dead as a finger pointing. We shrugged and told each other houses settle. That was how the first lie was spoken, soft and useful, and the night began with pizza boxes and movies and the warm, sloppy camaraderie of adults pretending to be teenagers for an evening. For an hour nothing seemed wrong. We traded the banal wounds of late 20-something life, talked about jobs we'd abandoned and partners we'd never quite explained to our parents, laughed with the practiced generosity of people who want to believe laughter can fix the small sinkholes. The house listened, it did not interrupt. Small things changed first, the way tides change in ways you do not notice until you discover sand in your shoes. A lamp would dim for a breath and then steady as if apologizing. A photograph on the mantel would be angled a fraction more toward the doorway when we looked away. Little domestic shifts you file under the heading of Bold House until you realize your folder is heavy with those reasons. Then there was a sound down the back hall, 3 measured taps, a pause, and 3 more, and the rhythm had the particular economy of someone who had practiced polite waiting for years. Caleb walked toward the doorway as if to show bravery and the sound retreated like a neighbor lowering their voice, tactful and private. We checked the bedrooms, the linen closet, even the attic hatch, because what else do you do when a house begins to mark its interest in you, and found only old coats stacked like chronologies and a guest room with sheets folded as if they expected occupancy. On returning, the mantel photograph was perfectly straight, the small crookedness gone, and someone laughed too loudly to keep from trembling. When a place begins to make corrections for you, it is not trying to startle, it is asking to be acknowledged. Courtesy, in that house, was a currency. We started leaving small things because the house rewarded attention the way an animal does. Offer your hand and it will allow you near its face. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses appeared on the coffee table one morning, lenses smudged with something like salt, and a torn scrap of paper was tied to the arm with a brittle ribbon. A single word was written on it in a careful hand, remember. We passed the glasses around, fingers circling metal cold with other people's skin, and joked because humor is the thin shield you use in unfamiliar situations. In return the house returned scraps, an old school photograph folded inside the pages of a book one of us swore they had not opened for a decade, a child's drawing slipped under a sofa cushion, a kettle left warm on the stove as if someone had been halfway through making tea and had been asked to go away for a moment. These gifts were not malevolent, they were domestic remittances, things that said, we existed, don't let us vanish. We began to barter. You leave a coffee cup upside down to mark you were here, the house leaves a photograph to mark you were remembered. It felt like an economy of sentiment, suspicious but manageable at first, until you discover that memories have interest and the interest compounds. Jonah was the first to notice the compounding. He had always been loud, the kind of friend who thought volume was armor, but after a few nights of bargaining he started to sleep in the den on a lawn chair as if elevation could keep him out of the house's sightlines. Once, he came to our group holding a little pair of slippers, the kind you imagine a grandparent knitting for a child who has long since grown, and the tag on them read keeps them warm in a hand that had the slant of someone patient and methodical. He left town within a month, and when we called him he said in a voice that had been thinned by distance that he couldn't stand the small corrections anymore. things moved back into the place where they had been as if some invisible hand resented amateur interference, and then he stopped explaining. The idea that memory could be negotiated and that the house was a broker for that transaction gnawed at some of us. Mason kept making jokes that fell apart at the end, and Nora kept leaving post-its at the mantel with names she feared losing, the two of them assembling a ritual out of nervousness more than faith. The ledger grew. We would misplace someone's coffee order, then find a scrap with the name written in a hand none of us recognized, and the name would return to our mouths the way a borrowed book is returned when you notice its absence. The house wanted not simply objects but witness. It would not be satisfied with being a repository, it wanted testimony. Over time that desire grew a particularity. The house learned voices. That is the strangest thing I remember. The way a tone will lodge in you like a grain of sand and will not leave until rubbed out. Houses that collect also practice mimicry, and mimicry is not always kind. It started small, a voice from the hallway calling a name in a cadence that belonged to someone absent, so natural it made your skin register like a hand being placed on your shoulder. The first time I thought it was my imagination. The second time, when Caleb flinched and named the voice before it had finished calling, we both knew we had crossed an unread page. His father had died 2 years before in an accident we had all watched the small prints of in town papers, yet there his name was called in the low, patient way we remembered. Jonah woke to his mother calling him down for dinner in a voice so exact it sounded like the house had the recording of her memory on a loop. The mimicry was uncanny because it was tender. It used the timbre of intimacy to get your attention, and in that tenderness lay a demand. It was learning what made us pay attention and then breeding those things until attention became a tax. There are ways to respond to a house that is asking for witness. You can ignore it, which feels defiant and sometimes hammer-headedly proud. You can laugh and leave, or you can give it what it wants in the cold, precise manner of clerks, say the names aloud, lay an object where the house will find it, make your record for its book. We tried all three. Ignoring felt like theft and fear mixed, so the option died quickly. Laughter became desperate and hollow and lasted until the middle of the night when the sound of the wind seemed to mimic a page being turned. We settled into the clerical work because it was pragmatic. We said names, our parents, people we had loved poorly, and left small markers. The house returned things in kind, letters folded with the date and a request to keep watch, a child's ribbon tied around the leg of a chair. A photograph with the back inscribed in a hand you could not place. Each return felt like partial repayment, still the ledger demanded new entries and the requests developed specificity, not only a name, but the way you said it, whether it carried affection, whether the object was left in a place of honor or hidden in a drawer. The house was picky. We tried to set rules. Don't go in the attic, said Caleb's aunt with the kind of absolute that makes superstitions feel like customs. Keep a light on in the hall, bring no strangers. The rules have teeth because they are repeated by people who have felt the cost of breaking them. For a while the rules kept us steady, a cup overturned here, a book laid open there, a photograph repositioned so its subject faced the doorway. Those acts of witnessing were almost tender, domestic tending more than exorcism. They bought a kind of peace that lasted in daytime, in the clean, indifferent light when work and errands make a house merely functional again. But human complacency is stubborn, and so when the house raised its demands we found ourselves underchargeable. The night it asked for more it did not do so with dramatic malice, instead the house trimmed its voice and tightened the ledger's language. The grandfather clock chimed a single long tone that settled like smoke, and the tiles under our feet hummed with a frequency that made the pictures on the walls tremble. A shadow traced along the hallway as if the sunlight had a memory and was trying to draw itself back. Not a shape that entered but an outline moving with deliberation, bending to point at an old closet, nudging a photograph, aligning a frame. Mason, in some combination of bravado and foolish curiosity, followed where it pointed and opened a shoebox hidden at the back of the closet. Inside were small things that should not have been there, a mitten with a tiny alphabet letter stitched by a hand that knew how to knot slowly. A ticket stub from a carnival 30 years gone, a Polaroid of a child by a swing set with the name scrawled on the back, "Keep watch." Placing the mitten on the mantel felt like making a deposit, and for a few nights the house returned a mellow warmth, a sense of balance restored. Those nights were gentle and domestic and heavy with the peculiar sanctity of people who have taken on a duty to remember. But economies harden, you learn the rate and find that the cost creeps. The mimicry grew more precise and greedy, voices remembered with such clarity they would call a person's name and lure them from bed. Jonah, before he left, said the house began to change the voice to a version of what it thought the person had been at their happiest and used that to call them back into the rooms. The ethics of that are ugly. What is it to summon the image of a lost parent's voice into an empty hallway just to have you answer? When we began to see the pattern, voices returned when names were left, artifacts reappearing when an object was given, we also began to notice the slippage. You leave a name to anchor memory, but the house wants the echo, and then it craves the original timbre and will, if permitted by habit, practice until it has something nearly indistinguishable from the person who once used it. There is a violence in that replication. Mimic love is a wound because it promises a touch that is not quite real. People began showing up with duller eyes. We were keeping things for a place that returned imitations and then asked for more. The most difficult lesson was one about ownership. You do not own memory because you are present in it. Memory is communal and stubborn, and once you agree to steward it, you accept that you must feed it without expectation of reward. The ant passed in the washed light of late April, and the house's demand sharpened into a bureaucracy of grief. Family came to gather, to take the things that belonged to them. And in the bottom of a trunk we found a ledger bound in leather, pages full of names and dates in neat, sober script. At the back of the ledger a photograph had been tucked between pages like a placeholder, on its reverse a single sentence, "Keep watch." It was instruction and plea, gentle and urgent and impossible to decline. We were left with custody, not of objects only, but of a house's insistence that names be recited and things be turned face up. Selling the house, as the family eventually did, felt like an attempt to discharge an obligation. Fresh hands might reset routines and the ledger might settle, but memory is sediment and sediment keeps shaping the current. Now when I drive past that street and see the porch light on later than seems reasonable, or a curtain twitched the wrong way, a small pressure gathers under my ribs because I recognize what it means to have been named a witness. Sometimes my phone will buzz in the night, a text from an unrecognized number with 3 short words, "You left something." I wake with the sense that somewhere, in a room where the dust has not yet settled, a name needs to be said aloud. The house was not monstrous at its heart, it was meticulous. It wanted to be held, to have its inventory kept fresh against that slow erasure that lives just beyond any life. If you ever enter a place with portraits tilted toward the doorway, or a clock striking out of time, or spectacles on a table with a scrap that says "Remember, do not laugh first," say the name you fear losing, place something small and returnable in the place it asks for, and then come back. Witnessing is not heroism, it is small domestic work done with attention until memory feels steady enough to breathe on its own. That is what the house taught me, that the tenderest obligations are not the ones shouted in the street but the ones kept by repeating a loved name until the world remembers to keep it too. I never expected the night to turn quiet in the way that matters, the soft, attentive quiet that is an absence of sound but presence waiting, and that is the small, treacherous thing these houses do, they teach you to confuse empty with harmless. I'd driven up to Claire's family home because reunion sleepovers are their own kind of ritual when you're in your mid-20s, a way to fold back the edges of who you were into something you can still recognize. The house sat on a long street in a town that had once been proud of its mills and now pretended it still was, all brick facades and porches that angled the same way the map did. Up close the place looked like every family house you might pass on Sunday, flags, potted mums, a mailbox with a name that has weathered into a friendly blur, so when Claire opened the door and said, "You made it," it felt natural to step across the threshold and leave the night behind. Inside, the living room smelled like coffee and something older, book oil, lemon polish, the faint cling of something that had been kept in the dark for too long. There were 5 of us that night, Claire, who had a laugh that softened arguments, Jonah, who kept making the same joke because we all pretended to find it funny, Priya, who brought store-bought cupcakes with a guilty pride, and me, the person who thought he knew what a harmless adult sleepover looked like. We laughed, argued about music, and stacked cups like trophies, and when Claire's mother mentioned in passing that the attic had been sealed since her grandmother's time, everyone said the polite things people say about houses, "Oh, those creaks, stories, old bones," and then we moved on because it's easier to keep moving than to ask why something stays shut. The house had a shape that made it seem like the rooms were arranged for privacy, each corner holding a different decade of living, a rotary phone that hadn't been answered in years, a shelf of chipped vases, a row of photographs that leaned like witnesses. We moved toward the den with blankets and a sense of a late-night conspiracy, and for hours the world reduced to cups and the glow of a television not quite bright enough to make the shadows leave. It was after 1 when conversation slowed and the kind of sleepy honesty that comes with too much sugar took its place. Someone made a confession about a job that no one was proud of, someone else admitted a small cowardice, and the house listened in that soft, political way houses learn when people have been coming to them for generations. Then Jonah, who liked to push edges for fun, asked in a too loud voice, "So what's the biggest stupid thing your parents do?" Which is how we uncover petty rituals as if they are archaeology. Claire's mother laughed and said, "We keep the attic locked. No reason, just old boxes." It should have ended there, because old boxes are only boxes until someone makes them a story. But the house heard the words and, as houses sometimes do, it answered in a language of small movements. At first it was nothing, a lamp nudged, a cushion arranged itself with an impossible neatness, a single page of a magazine turned though no draft crossed the room. We joked, because laughing gives you the illusion of control, and Priya said, "Maybe the attic keeps itself tidy." Jonah smiled, but his eyes were watching the ceiling like someone who knows too much about how sounds travel. The air had a humidity that felt like attention, it settled around the shoulders as if to remind us we were being observed. When Claire's mother passed the living room door on her way to check on something in the kitchen, she paused a beat longer in the hallway than she needed to and touched the doorframe. With a kind of reverence I'd seen before among people who lived with rules they don't explain. "Don't go into the attic, okay?" she said softly, and because the house had already shifted it wasn't a harmless motherly warning, there was meal plan gravity to it, a ledger already half written in the timber. We didn't open the attic, that kind of deferral should have been the end of it. But at about 2 in the morning the house chose a different approach, it started rewriting the ledger in smaller strokes, making invoices of attention that seemed almost casual until they formed a sum you couldn't ignore. I woke because the room changed temperature, the way a room changes when something that isn't weather decides to lean in, and because my cup had rolled an inch away though I hadn't moved. Jonah swore it was the cat, though the house didn't have a cat. The table lamp dimmed once and then brightened, like a person clearing their throat in a crowded room. We thought to ourselves we were being ridiculous and told ourselves stories about faulty wiring. But the joke stopped when sound collected at a distance, a slow tapping, not on a door but from overhead, above the ceiling where the attic lived in its perfect, dusty dark. The tapping was patient, 3 measured beats, then a pause, and then 3 more. It was not the kind of sound a house makes to announce settling, it was the sound of someone practicing polite knocks for a future they expected to be welcomed into. Claire swallowed and said nothing, her fingers finding the seam of the blanket like a person grasping for reality. I thought about leaving, about climbing the porch steps into a night that seemed less observant, but leaving in the company of friends and leaving for the sake of a private alarm felt like a childish superstitious gesture, so I stayed and deceived myself that staying made me braver than omission. The tapping continued, and it did something peculiar, the air around the attic door trembled as though someone had sighed through the keyhole. An old fixture on the wall rattled minutely. The listing of small, precise changes began to feel like choreography. Jonah, trying to be clever, suggested we go up, that we pry the ladder down and show the house we weren't afraid of dust. There are moments you should say yes to courage and moments you should not, and this was clearly the latter. Someone laughed to disguise the tremor, but the laughter had a brittle edge. We made a small covenant, ridiculous in its construct. Whoever went upstairs would be the one to open the attic only to prove there was nothing, confrontation as a cure. Jonah volunteered, because he liked to volunteer in the ways that later make a story about how brave he'd been, and Priya made a face like she'd rather do anything but. Claire's mother, who had been watching quietly, finally said, "No," the word slid into the room with a weight. "Not tonight, not ever," she added, and then, almost as an afterthought, "It's not for us to look." She did not say who us was, nor what it might be, and one learns quickly that the grammar of house rules often contains more truth in its omissions. Jonah protested with the cavalier courage of someone who hasn't yet learned the cost of being the first to cross an invisible line, but the house answered, softly this time, by making the lights hum in a frequency that felt like an old radio tuning to a frequency that belonged to itself. The air tightened in the way a throat tightens when a name you don't want to say is uttered. After that the house moved in increments meant to measure us. A photo shifted on the mantel so that the person in it looked less toward the center of the room and more toward the doorway, as if the house wanted witnesses near exits. A book we'd left open at the table was found closed and turned to a different page. The margin dog-eared where a sentence read like a request. Small things, but when you collect enough small things into a ledger you begin to sense the architecture of demand. I started leaving tiny offerings in response, not altars, nothing dramatic, just a cup set upside down on the counter, a shoe placed by the door so the house could count occupants. It became a barter of attention. The house repaid with retrievals, small mercies, a lost photograph returned to its frame, a note with a cutout of a child's drawing folded into a book I had been meaning to read. Mercy here smelled of dust and paper and something like apology. This slow exchange would have been tolerable, almost domestic, if it hadn't been accompanied by details the house could not plausibly manufacture on its own. Names began to slip around me like pebbles tossed into memory. I would find I could not remember the name of someone who had been central to me until a small object appeared with that name written in a cramped hand I did not recognize. I learned not to ask where the things came from because asking had a way of inviting explanations that the house did not offer. Once, in a mood to be foolish, I asked Claire if any of her relatives had been collectors of unusual things, someone who liked to leave lists and scraps inside walls. She shook her head slowly. My grandmother kept journals, she said, but she insisted they stay private. She used to say some doors you keep shut because the stories inside expect to be kept in a particular order. She paused as if that explained something, but it explained nothing. The attic's presence was thicker in the air each night, the way a photograph's image thickens when left to film too long. About a week after that first night the house escalated in a manner that was not theatrical but painfully bureaucratic. It began to ask in ways that resembled invoices. It wanted us to witness, and when we did it wanted us to remember. One night I woke to a low murmur. A voice that sounded like someone reading from a list, and when I followed the sound it led me to the hallway where the wallpaper peeled in a familiar shape, like a mouth opening slightly to speak. The voice was not a voice in English or any language I could name, it was syllables that fit together like dates in a ledger, names, locations, small sentences with the cadence of someone repeating the inventory of a life. I found a scrap of paper tucked under the door mat the next morning with a single word on it, remember. The handwriting was not mine, it had a looping curl I recognized, not from personal acquaintance but from the way my grandmother used to sign checks. There is an economy to remembrance and the house seemed to understand its accounting. The more we complied, if you could call leaving a crate of canned peaches and a lamp adjusted to face the hallway compliance, the more the house returned things that were almost tender. A photograph printed while film still existed appeared in the den one afternoon with the back labeled in a child's careful hand, "For when you forget me." I cried then, because some debts are paid in memory and the thought that a house could be a treasurer of such things made sorrow domestic. That night we drank too much coffee and talked in the kind of confessions that are too heavy for ordinary daylight. The house listened and then, as if approving of our honesty, left a little warmth under the radiator where my hand had been, an odd salve. Little trades continued for months like a bad habit you make and then don't notice until you try to quit. I should tell you we got braver. I should tell you we learned to command, to push back. Instead what happened was quieter, more earnest, we became accountants of the house's patience. Not everyone accepted the account, Jonah began to change after a while. He used to laugh and tell me he liked how the house made us pay attention to small things. But one evening I found him standing by the attic door like someone who'd been arguing with himself. He'd taken to tapping back, 3 beats when the house tapped, or whispering names into the light like spells. It didn't end well. One night I woke to find his shoes missing, a pair of small, handmade slippers tucked in the closet with the note "keeps them warm." He was fine, he left town after that, said he couldn't sleep, but he was never the same. He would not speak about the slippers or the quiet that filled him when he tried. We pretended these things were coincidences, we told ourselves patterns are what frightened people see when they want meaning. But the house kept its steady economy and the accounts tallied. Then came the night that finally felt like a closing item on a bill. We had grown complacent in our trades, thinking perhaps the balance would favor us if we kept paying attention. Claire's grandmother passed away in spring, an old woman who had outlived many of her keeping habits and whose shadow seemed to have been, for some reason, the audit the house deferred. After the funeral, people came and left in polite waves, flowers piled at the porch that wilted into polite compost. We had stayed overnight out of habit and sorrow, out of that dangerous desire to keep a vigil for people who taught us how to be attentive, and in the late hour the house decided to reconcile the ledger. The attic door, which had been sealed for decades with fresh paint and a proper wartime stubbornness, unlatched itself slowly with a sound like a sigh. Not dramatic, just a thin whisper across hinges. We'd never seen it do that before. Claire's mother stood in the doorway and watched as if she were watching a photograph redevelop. She didn't cry, she only said, "We let it be," as if to remind herself these were rules she had inherited and honored. We should have left then. I should have gone home and slept in the small, bright room of my apartment that has no history and consequently few demands. But grief makes people stay in places where rituals once were practiced. Grief is a kind of superstition that believes presence will keep the world from erasing dignity. So we climbed the ladder together. The attic smelled of cedar and old paper and something like sweet rot. Boxes were stacked in rows like rows of sleeping people, some were labeled in tiny hand, birthdays, ration coupons, recipe cards. In the corner a trunk sat with a small lock that had been broken years ago. When we pried it open, the breath of the attic seemed to change. We exhaled the way one exhales when a secret has finally been acknowledged. Inside we found stacks of journals tied with twine. On top lay a photograph, corners curled, a woman with a face that matched the smile Claire's mother sometimes wore when she thought of a good joke. On the back was written a single phrase in an old, steady script, "Keep watch." Beneath it, in a different hand, someone had scrawled a date and the name of a child. The ledger closed itself. We left the attic then, and when the ladder folded up the house felt like it had settled. The tapping stopped, the small mercies returned, blankets folded, cups rinsed, but something in me had changed. The house had not been malevolent in a way movies make sense of. It had been a keeper of small accounts, attention in exchange for memory, presence in exchange for mercy. Some nights it asked only for a witness, some nights its need for a witness was a weight you carried home. We carried it as one carries a heavy coat in wet weather, necessary and awkward and obvious on the shoulder. Claire's family moved the next year, an act as practical as any remedy, new walls, new pages, but it is not possible to move what you took home with you. Sometimes I wake with the impression of a soft knock at the edge of sleep, a careful series of beats like someone asking, politely, to be remembered. And sometimes, when I pass that town, the house at the corner still stands, its attic dark and patient, its windows polite witnesses. I drive by and feel the lightness and the gravity of having been an accountant in a domestic economy that pays in memories, and I wonder who else will pass by and think, that's just a house. They don't know about ledgers, and ledgers are patient things. I wasn't supposed to end up at Maddie's house that night. It was one of those last-minute teenage decisions, where everyone pretends they aren't tired and the world feels briefly elastic, like nothing bad can slip through the cracks if you stay close enough to people you trust. Her street sat at the quieter edge of town, where the woods formed a kind of dark, breathing border behind the houses, and every driveway carried the same suburban fingerprints, basketball hoops left crooked, mailboxes leaning from winter storms, porch lights trying too hard to look brave. I remember walking up her front steps with my backpack slung loose over one shoulder, the air cooler than it should have been for early summer, the sky soft and low like it had been pressed flat by something we couldn't see. Maddie opened the door before I knocked, smiling the way people smile when they're relieved someone actually showed up, and I stepped inside thinking it would be one of those harmless sleepovers where you run on too much sugar and not enough caution. I didn't know yet that the house itself hadn't wanted us there. Her living room always smelled faintly of cinnamon and old carpet, and the TV spilled warm color into the space the way memories spill into quiet houses. Two more friends were already there, Lena sitting cross-legged on a beanbag chair, some magazine open but unread in her lap, and Harper on the couch flipping the channels like she was waiting for the night to decide its mood. Everyone looked comfortable in that early evening way, the lights soft, the shadows gentle, nothing sharp or out of place. We talked about the usual things, school rumors, who liked who had started acting different since summer began, and the night stretched out like a lazy dog settling in at our feet. It felt safe, the way familiar rooms do before you learn they're only safe because you haven't yet seen what they look like in the dark. Around 10 the wind picked up outside, not dramatic. Just steady enough to make the trees behind the house sway like they were agreeing to something none of us had voted on. We played board games first, the kind of games no one actually likes but everyone pretends to like because sleepovers need a ritual. Maddie's dog, Bentley, kept pacing near the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, sniffing at the crack between the curtains as if someone had been standing there minutes before. I remember telling him to settle, but he wouldn't. He kept shifting his weight like he was listening for a voice only dogs register. The wind pressed harder against the house, a slow rising pressure that made the siding creak, and Harper joked that Maddie lived too close to the woods for comfort. Maddie rolled her eyes, but there was something in her expression, something flickering and uneasy, like she'd wanted to laugh and couldn't. The game pieces clicked across the board, the dog finally lay down, and for a few minutes the evening stabilized again, the world shrinking back to something we could manage. But houses have ways of warning you, and most warnings are soft enough to ignore. Around midnight, the electricity flickered. Not the full blackout kind of flicker, but the kind that looks like the house momentarily lost its nerve. The lamp beside the couch dimmed to a sickly amber before rebounding, the TV cut to static for half a heartbeat, and the ceiling fan slowed just enough for all of us to notice it. No one said anything at first because those moments hover between explanation and superstition, and teenagers, especially the ones who pretend they don't believe in anything, hate being the first to suggest something might be wrong. Then Lena said, very quietly, "Did you guys feel that?" And I knew the world had shifted an inch to the left. Not enough to panic, just enough to be noticed. Maddie glanced toward the hallway where the bedrooms were, her face suddenly too still. As if she expected someone to be standing there watching us. When no one was, she exhaled and tried smiling again, but the smile didn't settle right this time. It felt borrowed, like she'd taken it from someone else. We decided to move everything upstairs to her room, the snacks, the blankets, the movies, because the living room felt too open, too exposed. Her bedroom was smaller, with glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to the ceiling from when she was younger, and for a moment it made all of us feel like kids again instead of teenagers pretending adulthood is close enough to touch. Bentley followed us, but instead of lying near the bed like he usually did, he sat facing the door, ears stiff, body alert. Harper tossed him a piece of popcorn, and he didn't even blink. Outside, the wind had stopped completely. The kind of stop that doesn't sound like silence but like waiting. At first nothing much happened. We put on a movie, talked over it, ate too many gummy worms. But gradually, so gradually I didn't even realize it at first, the house began doing that thing old houses do when they want to correct the story you're telling about them. Small sounds rearranged themselves, a creak down the hallway that didn't match footsteps, the subtle press of air as if someone had opened a door to a room we weren't supposed to enter, the quiet tap of something against the side of the house though the wind was dead still. I remember glancing at the digital clock on her nightstand, 12:57, and then looking again what felt like 10 minutes later to see 12:58 glowing back at me. Everything slowed, stretched, as if time itself had paused to listen. Bentley growled once, low and uncertain, and Maddie whispered, "He only growls like that when someone's near the stairs." But no one moved toward the hallway to check because the hallway had started feeling like something alive. It was Lena who noticed the shadows first. We were all sitting in a circle of blankets and dim lamplight. And she kept staring at the far corner of the room where the light didn't quite reach. I asked her what she was looking at, and she said, "The corner's wrong." We followed her gaze. At first it just looked darker than usual, but then I saw what she meant, the darkness wasn't flat. It had depth, shape, a kind of slow shifting like someone was standing there breathing too quietly for us to hear. Maddie insisted it was just the shadow of her dresser, but even she didn't sound convinced. Shadows aren't supposed to lean, they aren't supposed to tilt a fraction closer each time you blink. The air grew colder, not dramatically, not movie cold, but the kind of cold that means a house is remembering something. Maddie got up to close the window, but it was already latched. When she came back to sit with us, the blankets felt heavier, like someone else had been holding them a moment earlier. Harper whispered, "This house is weird, Mads," and Maddie said nothing, just stared at the corner like she was trying to place a face she almost recognized. I leaned against the wall and felt a small vibration run through it, like a heartbeat. Houses aren't supposed to have heartbeats. Not the kind you can feel. We tried making jokes to break the tension, but each joke fell apart halfway through, landing flat and brittle. The corner of the room seemed to pulse in its own rhythm, the darkness breathing just slightly too slowly to match ours. Then something shifted, not the shadow, but the room itself. A momentary tilt, as if the floor dipped a fraction, enough for the water bottle near the bed to roll an inch on its side. Bentley stood up so fast he hit his head on the underside of the desk. Maddie's breath caught, and she whispered, "Okay. I need to tell you something." Her voice had that tone people use when they know they waited too long to explain something. She told us her family had only moved into the house a year earlier, and the first few months had been fine, normal, boring, forgettable, but around October her little brother started saying there was someone in his room at night. He described a tall woman who stood near the foot of his bed whispering things he couldn't understand. They wrote it off as nightmares, imagination, typical kid stuff, until Maddie herself heard footsteps in the hallway around 2 or 3 a.m. every night for a week straight. Not soft ones, deliberate ones, slow enough that she could count the space between each step. She said her parents brushed it off, the way parents do when the alternative feels impossible, but Maddie had stopped sleeping alone for a while. She told us she hadn't wanted to bring it up earlier because she didn't want us to think she was making it up. Before any of us could respond, a soft knock came from the hallway. Not on the door, somewhere farther back, a slow, deliberate tapping, 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Bentley growled again, sharper this time, tail tucked tight, whole body angled toward the sound like he was bracing for something. Maddie clapped her hand over her mouth. Harper whispered, "Please tell me someone else heard that," and when none of us denied it, the room seemed to shrink, the air thinning as if the house was startled we'd finally noticed. The knock came again, only twice this time, not impatient, just certain. We didn't open the door. You'd think one of us might have worked up the courage, but courage is something sleepovers pretend to have until the dark asks you to prove it. Instead we huddled closer, watching the door like it might inhale. Lena started crying silently, and Maddie reached for her hand, but before their fingers touched, the bedroom light flickered again. Not a harmless flicker, this one felt personal. The glow dimmed to a thin, trembling layer of gold, and for a second the entire room looked washed out, like a photograph from a decade none of us had lived through. In that moment the shadow in the corner stretched taller, so slow you'd miss it if you blinked, leaning toward us with the kind of patience that suggested it had been waiting a very, very long time. The knock stopped, but something else started, a whisper. Faint, disjointed, drifting up from the floorboards beneath us like the house was leaking secrets. At first I thought it was the wind finding its way through the siding, but there was no wind. The whisper strengthened, still soft, but structured, like words spoken through water. Maddie pressed her ear to the floor before any of us could stop her, and she jerked back so fast she hit the dresser. "She's under us," she whispered, her eyes huge, "she's under the floor." The room felt suddenly heavier, like gravity had deepened. We listened, breath held, and the whispering grew clearer, not modern speech, not anything casual or conversational. It sounded old, like language being reused after years of disuse, syllables dragging across each other like footsteps on a long staircase. The boards beneath my feet warmed slightly, then cooled, then warmed again, a rhythm too deliberate to be settling wood. I shifted away, pulling the blankets closer, my heartbeat scraping my ribs. The shadow in the corner leaned again, closer now, its outline just barely visible, an elongated form, tall and slanted, like a person whose edges didn't line up correctly. It didn't step forward, it just watched, the way a house watches trespassers. Suddenly, from somewhere deep under the house, something knocked back. One single, heavy thud against the foundation. Enough to rattle the lamp, enough to make all four of us jerk in unison. Bentley barked, sharp and terrified, backing against the bed, claws scraping the floor. Maddie whispered, we should go downstairs, but none of us moved. Because downstairs meant closer to whatever was beneath us. Harper shook her head, pointing toward the window facing the backyard. We go out that way, she said. Straight outside, it wasn't a bad idea, except for the fact that the window latch slid open by itself, slowly, noiselessly, right as she said it. None of us breathed for several seconds. The wind hadn't returned, nothing physical had touched it. Yet the latch sat lifted, the window now loose in its frame like an invitation. Maddie whispered, she doesn't want us to leave, and the room seemed to exhale at the exact moment she said it, the curtains pulling inward as if something were drawing air from outside into the house. The hallway beyond the bedroom door creaked. Not footsteps, weight shifting, waiting. Bentley sprinted first. He bolted out of the room, down the hallway, toward the stairs. His collar jingled wildly, the sound fading too quickly, like he'd been swallowed by distance that shouldn't exist in a small house. Harper yelled his name and ran after him, and Lena grabbed my arm so tightly her nails left marks. Maddie hesitated for a single heartbeat, glancing back at the corner one last time. The shadow hadn't moved, or maybe it had moved so perfectly we didn't see the transition. She whispered, don't look at it, and then we ran. The hallway felt longer than it should have, stretched thin like taffy, the floorboards bowing under our steps as if something beneath them was pressing upward. The air smelled like old soil and something metallic, like rust mixed with cold breath. Harper already reached the staircase, but she froze there, one hand gripping the banister, staring down into the dark. Where's the light? She hissed. The switch on the wall didn't work, the stairs disappeared into a thick blackness that felt dense enough to touch. Bentley barked again from below, farther away this time, like he'd slipped into a space deeper than the ground floor. Maddie whispered, don't go down. But Harper shook her head, I can't leave him. Before she took another step, the darkness at the base of the stairs brightened for a moment, not with light, but with shape. A tall figure stood there, so still it might have been carved from the dark itself. No features, no edges, just absence compressed into a human outline. One arm lifted slowly, unnaturally, bending the wrong way at the elbow as if the shadow remembered the gesture but not the anatomy. It pointed toward us, or past us, or through us. Then the form dissolved back into the darkness like ink bleeding through paper. Harper screamed. We ran back toward the bedroom, not because it was safe but because it was the only place we remembered how to reach. The house felt alive now, breathing too deeply, every doorframe bending slightly inward as we passed, the floor groaning under pressure that wasn't ours. The whispering returned, louder, no longer beneath us but around us, threading through the drywall like veins. Maddie grabbed her phone, but the screen was static white, glowing too bright, too artificial, like it had forgotten how to be a phone. Lena tried hers, same thing. My phone stayed black no matter how many times I pressed the button. The world outside the windows flickered, the backyard shifting between darkness and something else, something pale and moving. Then the corner shadow stepped forward. Not fast, not aggressively, just, deliberately, as though it had waited for our attention and now that it had it, it could stop pretending to be part of the wall. Its shape clarified as it moved, tall, impossibly thin, head tilting side to side as though adjusting to the height of the room. The temperature dropped with each step it took, a slow draining cold that made the edges of the blanket stiffen. Bentley barked from somewhere in the house, followed by a short, yelping sound that cut off too suddenly to be natural. Maddie gasped, doubling over as though something had pressed fingers into her spine. The shadow jerked its head toward her, noticing the sound. I don't know what pushed us into motion. Survival instinct, maybe. Or the fact that the house seemed to be folding inward, the walls bending subtly like they were being drawn toward that shadow. We sprinted for the window, not the one that had opened itself, but the smaller one near the dresser. Maddie shoved it upward, and for a second I thought it would jam, but it slid open with an ease that didn't belong to old houses. Harper climbed out first, dropping into the soft mulch beds below. Lena followed, then me, and Maddie last. The moment her feet hit the ground outside, the window slammed shut behind her hard enough to crack the glass. Outside, the air smelled normal again, fresh, cool, harmless. The house loomed above us, its windows black, the backyard still except for the soft sway of the trees. It looked like any other house, completely innocuous, completely wrong. Maddie grabbed our hands and whispered, "Don't look back." We didn't, not until we reached the sidewalk at the end of her street, and even then, none of us could tell which window the shadow had been standing in. Because maybe it never needed a window. Maybe houses don't trap things, maybe they shelter them. And maybe that night we weren't supposed to stay over. Maybe we just interrupted something that had been waiting for the dark to get deep enough to finish what it started. We never spent another night there. Maddie's family moved 2 months later. She said they found something under the floor when workers came to replace the insulation, an old, sealed crawlspace packed with dirt and pieces of clothing that didn't belong to anyone living. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. Because every once in a while, when the nights get very still, I think about that shadow leaning forward one slow inch at a time, and I wonder how long it waited before someone opened a window and gave it a way out. And if it ever learned how to find the rest of the people who never meant to see it. I never planned to end up there, those places America leaves on the side of the map, halfway forgotten, halfway waiting, where the lights feel a little too far apart and the night carries stories nobody volunteers to tell. But most trouble in this country doesn't begin with a scream, it begins with something small. A turn you weren't supposed to take, a door someone should have locked, a message you should have ignored, and that night, I ignored all of it. I said yes because it was easier than saying no, because Jenna had been my friend since high school and her invite still carried that charm of shared history that makes the awkwardness of adulthood shrink for a few hours. The house she grew up in sat at the end of a cul-de-sac like a punctuation mark, neat, deliberate, the kind of place whose paint tones matched the hedges and who tried to teach you the rhythm of ordinary life. She'd promised pizza, a rickety stack of old VHS movies, a night where we pretend we were still the kind of people who slept over each other's houses without feeling like we were rearranging our adult lives for the weekend. I drove through the kind of dusk that seems to press color into everything but refuses to commit to dark, the trees along the road making a low rustle like paper being thumbed, and when I pulled up the porch light blinked on like a small, embarrassed witness to the fact I'd arrived on cue. Inside the house smelled like lemon cleaner and cinnamon rolls gone too long. It felt welcoming in the way towns make themselves out to be, warm, rehearsed, willing. There were 5 of us when the night began, Jenna and me, Mara from our old poetry group, Louise who always brought bad wine and better sarcasm, and Clara, who laughed like a sound someone else had taught her. We arranged blankets and pillows into a wide nest in front of the television, the kind of nest that makes adults laugh at themselves for acting like kids, and for a few hours the world contracted to stories we could tell each other. It started light, jobs we hated, old crushes, the kind of small confessions you tell to prove you are still human. Then Jenna mentioned the attic. She said it so casually I almost missed the way she said it, the casualness that wasn't casual at all but the practiced tone of someone rehearsing a truth to protect themselves from the enormity of it. Dad never wanted anyone up there, she said, stirring her soda with a straw. Said some things were better left boxed. Her voice held the same tone my mother uses when she mentions an old argument in order not to say the end of it aloud. We laughed it off, the polite laughter of people who prefer not to fish for meaning, but the house reacted anyway. The string lights along the mantel hummed for a beat and went dim, a small, involuntary concession. When you are young you get used to houses keeping secrets because childhood teaches you how to ignore small alarms, the stairs that creak at a particular time, the radiator that clanks like a tired clock, the shadow in the pantry that looks like a person if you stand just so. As adults, we are supposed to have outgrown that practice, we have mortgages and grocery lists and a politics of plausible explanations. Still, that night the house learned to speak in less subtle vowels. The first real thing it did was small, a deliberate, contained movement that read like courtesy because that is the cunning way this kind of place begins a ledger with you. I noticed it when I reached for my soda and felt the coffee table nudged slightly to the left. Not a crash, not a dramatic rearrangement, just a margin nudged a little to the edge. Someone joked that the house wanted our coasters aligned. We joked because making jokes is the social equivalent of lighting a candle in a room you don't entirely trust. It creates a light you can point to and say, "See, it's ordinary." But you can't keep a joke lit forever, especially when the thing you are joking about has patience. The attic was a locked thought in the house. Jenna said her father kept boxes up there he never wanted anyone to touch. He died the year before, quietly, and the house had kept him the way houses keep the shape of a person, like an indentation at sea glass left for someone to remember. That night, as we passed a bowl of popcorn between us, the attic pull-down door, thin, cedar, painted the pale color of domestic compromise, shifted as if it had been given a second. It did not bang open. It simply made a single small sound, the exact noise a closet makes when you close it too gently, as if it had been nudged by a finger learning to greet. Whoever laughed at that sound let their laugh trail off. It is hard to keep the sound of mirth when a house decides to be remembered. The second movement was the one we could not rationalize away. It began as a step, not a footstep in the hallway but a measured, internal rhythm, like someone counting on the inside of the walls. The sound was soft, padded, almost domestic, the way a person pads across hardwood in slippers. It measured 4 beats and then stopped, as if testing our attention like someone testing the patience of an audience. We all paused. Luis, who likes to pretend he is brave for the theatrics of it, said, joking but not really, "Old houses settle." Jenna's hand tightened around her cup and an expression crossed her face I didn't like, an old worry, the kind of worry that has lived long and knows where to hide. I noticed then how the corners of the room changed, shadow pooled differently under the lamp, and the coat on the chair, one we'd all seen earlier, had been folded with a neatness I didn't remember. Whoever or whatever moved in that house preferred its order. We gathered our courage in the way people gather blankets, wrapping the illusion of safety around our limbs, and played a dare game after midnight, that ridiculous habit adults adopt to claim a thin bravery. We wrote names on slips of paper and placed them in an old shoebox someone had found in a closet. The rules were childish and the ceremony felt like a rehearsal for something older. Write a name, fold it, close the box, listen to the house if it answers. It was a dare disguised as nostalgia, but a dare given in the wrong room is not harmless. The box sat in the center of the nest like a small altar, the lamplight pooled and made the carpet look grainy, the way the world looks when you focus too closely on a texture you cannot name. Later, when the movie credits crawled like tired bees, the house made a sound that was not mechanical but very exact, hiss, a kind of rustle that came from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. It wasn't the usual weatherwork of settling timber or the wind performing its amateur tricks with old window seals, it felt more like fabric being dragged gently over the floor. The 5 of us held our breaths because holding your breath is a small, social ritual. If everyone holds, maybe the thing we don't want to validate remains unacknowledged. The rustle came again, and this time it had a shape, a bundle of fabric, boxy and small, had been dragged to the threshold of the hall. It rested there like a deliberately left parcel. My first impulse was to reach out and pick it up, basic curiosity, the thing that has made us humans corridors of investigation, but there was an etiquette you learn only in places that earn the right to tell you their rules, and that etiquette is patience. Jenna closed her eyes, and I could tell, because friends' red faces, she was counting the squares on the ceiling where the plaster had cracked the way a person counts to stay sane. "We should leave it," she said softly, as if speaking the instruction would make the parcel obey. We did not leave it, the parcel unfolded itself like a slow confession. A small slipper, worn at the heel, a child's picture with the edges browned and the colors bled like a watercolor left in the rain, and beneath it a scrap of paper with a hand scrawl I did not know. The scrawl said only, "Keep watch." It was neither a command nor a threat, it was an account entry, a tiny note in the ledger of small attentions this house required. Sometimes the most dangerous things arrive as modest requests. After that night the house and I entered a conversation that felt like a correspondence course. The house would do something small, rearrange a photograph on the mantel so the face would look out the window, fold a blanket with an absent-handed neatness, leave a coffee cup emptied and rinsed in the sink, and in return, I would leave something to show I had listened, a note, a light left on, my shoes placed together by the door. It became a choreography of civility, not unlike keeping a communal living arrangement, except the other resident never spoke in voices we could answer to and never took credit for the kindnesses it gave. I started taking inventory like someone keeping a budget. A mug moved to the opposite side of the counter. A book I had meant to return to the library was placed on top of my current read with a 50-cent note tucked inside its pages that was not mine. Small things with that pattern of intention. The house was not cruel, it was meticulous and exacting, and that is a kind of hunger that accumulates interest. The payments it asked for were not always generous. Memory, I discovered, can be billed. A name you always knew would slip like a pebble from the hollow of your day and then, after you had left a small care in the place it asked for, return with a new fidelity. I would misplace a simple fact and then, after nights of attentive listening and leaving a cup by the sofa, the fact would arrive back like a paid bill, the name of my neighbor, a direction to a childhood place, the exact year of a band's record I loved. It is trivial in the ledger of life, and yet the trades added up in ways that felt costly. You learn to accept small thefts in exchange for the returns if you believe, as I did then, that attention is a form of currency the world can pay you back in. There were moments the house rewarded you in ways that felt like mercy. The cat from next door, an animal that never liked visitors, started coming to nap in the patch of sun the living room window made each morning, curling itself on the middle of the couch as if that cushion were precisely its place. A photograph was oriented differently one day, the face in it turned toward a window that allowed the subject to be seen in the morning light, and for reasons I could not explain I felt like someone had folded a corner of my life into place. But every mercy came with its price. Sometimes a line of a song would fade from my head for a week, or the name of a coworker would refuse to surface even when I strained for it, until I allowed the house to settle what it wanted by performing the small ritual it had taught me. The house's ethics were not those of brutal demand but of curated attention, and they suited the rhythms of people who keep lists. Months unspooled like this, measured in careful little exchanges. The neighbors got used to seeing me at odd hours plumping cushions and straightening photos as if I were some obsessive caretaker, and they told the story back to each other with the softened edges that turned gossip into myth. The woman who lived across the cul-de-sac, who had watched Jenna grow up, came once and stood on the porch watching me fold a blanket. She placed a hand on the arm of the couch in the way someone touches an old friend, and said, "He liked things kept proper, wires neat, books in order." She did not elaborate. There was a history she had inherited that she would not explain, because neighborhood liars and keepers alike prefer to see the final page to the house itself. I understood then that I was not steward of the haunting so much as a temporary accountant and that the ledger would outlast me. You ask whether I regret the nights I kept watch. It is complicated. When the house returned a memory to me, soldiering it out after I had paid it in petty attentions, it felt like tenderness. There is a strange human gratitude when the world honors the things we think are lost, names, faces, the exact wording of a joke. But there is also a weariness, because being the person who is always mindful becomes a small exhaustion that makes you sleep with your clothes half on and a light in the hallway. The final thing the house asked was not dramatic. It sent, folded into an envelope and tucked under a cushion, a photograph of someone I might have been and a note in a hand I had come to recognize: "Keep them tidy." It read less like a command and more like a gentle resignation. When Jenna moved away a year later, because houses have a way of making life feel like a ledger you'd rather cash out of, the cul-de-sac settled again into its polite silence. I helped her carry boxes to a van and waved as she drove off, the van a bright, ordinary thing heading down a street that suddenly felt too quiet. The house kept its neatness and, like some old librarian, continued its small business of remembering and returning. I still go by sometimes, if I am in the neighborhood, and the living room looks the way it always did, cushions plumped, photographs in order, a cup washed and drying in the sun. Once, very late on a winter night when the street lamps were tired and the curb sounded like someone rapping at a slow tempo, I stood on Jenna's porch and left a small string of lights in a bag at the edge of the walkway like a payment. The lights were cheap and they blinked politely the next week when I came by. The house had a way of accepting odd offerings and making them seem like charity. If there is a moral, it is a modest one: attention is not neutral. Some places in this country are repositories for small debts. They ask for witnesses and, when you provide them, they sometimes give back the things you misplace: a name, an exact memory, the sense of life had a particular contour you'd forgotten. The trades are small and not always kind. They are not part of the glamorous horror you pay movie tickets to see. They are domestic, persistent, and patient. They fit into the quiet corners of lives where people keep lists and run errands and then forget a name for a day or two because the world demanded a favor. Sometimes the favor is small and merciful, and sometimes it is exacting enough to make you wonder who is keeping the books. Either way, if you find a house on a quiet block with an attic that never seems to be opened, and someone tells you not to fuss with the boxes, listen to them. Keep your hands polite. Offer a cup if it seems to want one, and when the house asks you to keep watch, do it as if you were settling a small account, because some things prefer to be tended, and sometimes tending is the only way they learn to rest. I never meant to spend my 30s learning to hold a house's attention, but some places have a slow way of inserting themselves into your life until the edges of you are folded into their routine, and Caleb's aunt's house did that exact thing. It leaned into our lives with the patience of a ledger and the stubbornness of an old debt. He'd inherited the place the way families inherit responsibilities, quietly, without ceremony, after his aunt passed, and the neighborhood, being the kind of Midwestern pocket that measures respect in lawn lengths and the number of years a mailbox has leaned, pretended not to notice. When he asked us to come up for a reunion sleepover, I said yes because it felt like a small proof that we hadn't splintered completely, the four of us who'd once slept in one another's living rooms and thought the world could be held together by jokes and a kind of loyalty that doesn't ask for receipts. The house sat on a bend in the road where the map narrows into trees and the streetlights thin to a polite scatter, and even from the car I felt the place reading me. The porch light threw a pool of tired yellow onto the ancient step, and the swing moved with a slow-motion breeze that made it look as if someone had just stepped off it. Small things that don't matter when you're in your 20s keep mattering later, the way a loose tooth keeps reminding you it's there until it's gone. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and the repressed sweetness of old books, notes of lemon oil, dust settled like a good memory into every surface, and there were footprints of other lives printed into the grain of the floors. Caleb greeted me with that exhausted, half-grateful smile that was his default now, like he had done a favor by inviting us and was already apologizing for the trouble our presence might cause. Nora and Mason were in the den when I walked in, a stack of mismatched board games propped between them on the coffee table, beer bottles in reach. The kind of mise-en-scene that promises an evening where past selves might nestle close for a while. We talked like people who expect normal evenings, work talk softened into stories about the town, nostalgia filtered through a present that keeps changing the terms. The house listened, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but with a slow attentiveness, the kind that makes you aware of how much space is capable of feeling occupied without a single extra body in it. At first, the house's oddities were the soft, household things you blame on age, an angled picture frame on the mantel that tilted when no one was nearby, a lamp that dimmed for a missed heartbeat and then steadied, the radiator clicking like an old throat clearing. These are the small behaviors people learn to explain away because explanation feels less costly than worrying. Old houses do little things and we call them settling. We shrugged and traded those explanations like a joke, desperate to keep the evening anchored in the ordinary. We moved our sleeping bags to the living room because it felt right, because the den's couch had enough history to cradle us, and for hours the night obeyed the rhythms we preferred: conversation, a movie murmuring from the muted television, the soft clack of game pieces relocated into the shadow of tall lamps. Caleb's dog, an aging golden named Bentley with more dignity than patience, routinely followed us until he settled near the hearth, chest rising and falling in a slow metronome that made the room feel steadier. And then, sometime around midnight when the outside wind deepened into something that sounded like branches thinking, the house began to make requests in ways houses cannot make loudly, a tap in the back hallway that arrived in a measured cadence, 3 careful knocks, a pause, 3 again, the tiny arithmetic of someone asking permission rather than taking it. The sound could have been wind, the reasons 1,000. But there's an instinct that lives behind the sternum and declares when an ordinary explanation has had its final run. The tapping repeated with a pattern that felt rehearsed. It was deliberate enough to be polite, odd enough to be personal, and the room settled into that particular silence where people stop making jokes because the atmosphere has begun to speak in a language you don't yet understand. Caleb walked toward the hallway then, slow, the way men walk when they want to show they're not afraid for the sake of someone else, and the knock retreated, as if hearing his step discouraged it from advancing. He checked the bedrooms, one by one, empty, undisturbed, closets holding decades of coats and nothing modern enough to explain the present. We returned to the living room and pretended, clumsily, that normalcy could be resumed. The mantel picture frame, which had been cocked by a hair earlier, straightened itself almost precisely as if some invisible hand had nudged it, setting the photograph's subject looking more squarely at the doorway. Little adjustments like that are the sort of gestures that feel private when you notice them but look like weather when spoken aloud, and we laughed out of embarrassment because laughter insists that maybe we hadn't noticed anything at all. But the laugh sounded thin, a tape stretched too tight. We were trying to stuff the unknown into a drawer labeled "Explained," while the house kept adding receipts. The tapping evolved. It learned us, it slid under the floorboards as a whisper, or perhaps it never changed and we only sharpened in our attention. In any case, the sounds became layered, soft scrapes along old wood, a patient shifting like someone weighing each step before finishing it. Then, when the clock surrendered to the small hours, a new sound threaded through the house, a whispering that came from the hallway, low and precise, syllables that didn't belong to anyone in the room and yet had cadence. The soft melody of an old family story told in a language you'd heard at the edge of memory. It wasn't a voice trying to be human, it was speech folded back into itself until it resembled memory more than expression. The words, when you could make them out, were not sentences so much as accountings, names, dates, small domestic instructions, uttered in a careful tone, as if the house had been holding lists and had finally decided to read them aloud. We listened because there is curiosity in terror, the small, perverse wish to understand why the world has started to tick at odd hours. When the whispering stopped, the house did another improbable thing, it reached out to repay the attention we'd given it with an offering. A pair of old spectacles, wire-framed and slightly rusted, sat atop the coffee table where we had been laughing minutes before. None of us had seen them in the house before. They weren't ours, they fit none of our faces. We passed them around with the awkwardness of people handling a stranger's relic, the nose pads cold, the lenses smudged with the residue of tears or perhaps sea salt. On the arm of the spectacles someone had looped a tiny scrap of paper, faded to the sepia of careful handling. One word, in a handwriting that looked like it might have been taught with a ruler, remember. Gifts and haunted stories come with bargains, this one came with a soft, intimate quality that felt less like threat than entreaty. We folded the paper away like a coin given to a beggar and tried to tell ourselves this was a kindness, the sort of domestic mystery that might be solved by a neighbor with a story of attic cleanouts and lost eyeglasses. But we were adults now, disbelieving and practiced, so we recited plausible origins for the spectacles until the house, patient as ledgers are, displayed its next demand. It started to ask for witnesses, the first evening's minor reparations became a steady economy, a lost recipe reappeared in the den with a margin note. A child's drawing turned up in a book no one in our group had read in years, small reminders that memory was something you could lose and then be lent again. We began leaving things, a cup placed face down on the counter to mark a presence, a shoe set near the door like an offering, a note with a joke scrawled on it that we tucked into a mantel drawer. The house responded with things that felt like mercy, an old photograph turned face up on a shelf, a song whistled faintly from an open vent, but these mercies came with costs measured not in money but in attention. Names slipped from our throats on certain mornings and returned only after we found a scrap with the missing name written in an unfamiliar, looping hand. Jonah, who had always claimed he loved the weird, started to change, his laugh shortened and his eyes took on a distance, the look of someone who had been instructed to guard a secret he had not asked for. He put on small acts of bravery like coats, but one night he found a small pair of homemade slippers tucked under his bed with a note that read, "Keeps them warm." He packed up his life a month later and left town, and when he called to explain he said nothing about the slippers. People process the unexplainable into stories, but Jonah's silence was his story, and silence is the kind of answer that settles like dust. The house's requests escalated in the language of tenderness and inconvenience. Arrange the mantel to tilt the family portraits toward the doorway, leave a kettle on to boil and then be found gently cooled, set a chair in the hallway so someone might sit in it when the house could no longer hold on. The items it returned were not malevolent, instead they read like careful corrections, a child's pair of mittens folded into a neat square with the thumbs tucked, a book returned with a receipt from a millinery store pasted inside, evidence of lives that had once crossed through the rooms and left their marks. The thing the house wanted most was to be seen, not to terrify us. That wanting, when you taste it, is softer than threat and harder to ignore. We began to consider ourselves caretakers in a strange bureaucracy, giving attention, leaving small offerings, and thereby ensuring the balance did not tip towards something less forgiving. One night, in a move that felt more like curiosity than courage, Caleb's aunt's old chest was pried open by hands that trembled slightly despite rational resolve, and among the yellowed papers and moth-eaten shawls someone found a ledger, narrow, leather-bound, edges foxed by use. The pages were filled with lists, names, dates, places where people had been seen entering the house, brief notes about favors owed, small kindnesses returned, an accounting ledger of a domestic sort that made everything feel administratively inevitable. At the back of the ledger a photograph had been slipped between pages like a bookmark. It was a black-and-white portrait of a child standing in a doorway, a small, serious face turned to the camera with a look of a person who has swallowed a secret they are guarding. On the back of the photograph, in a hand less neat than the ledgers, someone had written, "Keep watch." The imperative was not angry, it had the tone of an instruction given to a loved one, necessary, inevitable, and almost impossible to refuse. In the days that followed, the house's demands congealed into something with a structure. It wanted guardianship of memories and in exchange offered the small courtesies that memory can afford, a name returned, a photograph preserved, a song hummed in the night that soothed sleep. But nothing that asks for attention forever takes kindly to slippage. There came a night when the house's patience reached a ledger's final line, and the balance called for settlement. We had grown lazy in our rituals, thinking perhaps the account had done its accounting and the house would now settle back into benign eccentricity. That night, our complacency was a candle in a wind, the tapping in the hallway began, but this time it was accompanied by a more articulate sound, a shadow moving along the floor with a center of gravity that did not belong to any of us. It moved like someone pacing in exact circles, measuring and then measuring again, like a person who had counted the days and found them insufficient. Then, with a pace that felt both patient and impatient at once, the shadow paused at the mouth of the living room and unfurled a shape that cast across the hardwood with the clarity of sunlight on ink, the outline of a hand, elongated and perfect, its fingers bending and flexing as though practicing gestures it had once known. It was not solid, but it had edges sharp enough to cut the air. The hand did not reach in, it beckoned, it did the small thing of asking. When it moved, the house filled with sound, old music seeping from the vents like a memory mistaken for a radio broadcast, drawers opening softly, the slow, precise rustle of paper turning. Mason, braver than most of us believed or perhaps more resigned, stood and walked toward the shape because bravery is a kind of currency people spend when they believe they can buy back normalcy. The hand pivoted, pointing not toward him but toward the back hallway, the house's palms showing which story wanted to be honored that night. The shadow's outline flickered like a candle flame burned steady by a light someone else held, and when it went still the old murmur in the walls rose into a voice that, if you strained, could be understood as a list of names and dates. It said nothing menacing, it asked for remembering. Mason came back shaking. He'd walked the hall and found, in a closet none of us had opened in years, a shoebox packed with toys and a tiny, furred mitten with a single letter stitched on in crude thread. The mitten smelled of other winters and lent a reality to the ledger that paperwork alone could not provide. He placed the mitten on the mantel with the care of someone setting down an offering and said nothing else. The house exhaled. For several long minutes we sat with the domestic need of it, the room felt like a small altar. It did not want us destroyed. It wanted its histories kept in active memory, not left to rot in a closet or to be blotted out by the busy cruelty of forgetting. Time, as it does, moved us forward. Caleb's family sold the house the following spring. Moving is, in certain American myths, the rite that fixes bad stories into clean edges. They repainted, they moved the furniture, and the new owners, an earnest couple with bright plans and a dog that barked at the neighbor's cat, lived there for a smooth summer. For a while, the house seemed content to fold itself into ordinary life, to accept the new rituals that come with fresh hands, water the plants, leave the shoes by the door, hang an awkward wreath. But houses do not undo what has been stored in their bones. A memory is not like a stain you scrub, it is more like a grain of sand in a riverbed, change the water and the grain shifts but it still shapes the stream. Years later I drove past on a late autumn afternoon and saw the porch swing move slowly in the wind as it had the first night I came. The house looked settled, its windows reflecting a sky free of unusual motion. I slowed the car and felt the same small pressure under my skin that people sometimes feel when they remember a childhood hallway or a phrase their grandmother used to say. I wondered who would be looking after that house's small accounts now. Would they notice the glasses that sometimes appear on the coffee table? Would they set a cup face down and call it superstition? Would they, like us, learn to keep the light on for the things that ask to be seen? If you ever find yourself carrying the dull ache of a name you can't quite recover, leave the house a small thing, a penny folded into the corner of a book, a photograph tucked beneath a cushion, a short note that says simply, I remember. It is not an invocation so much as a bookkeeping. I learned that keeping watch is not being brave in the theatrical sense, it is the slow, patient insistence of a life that refuses to let memory slip without an audience. The house asked for witnesses, and we gave them. We kept its small accounts with the fumbling reverence of people who know how easily things disappear when no one's looking. There is no neat ending to this, there shouldn't be. Memory is a long-term obligation, and some obligations don't end with a deed, they become the thing you carry quietly, night after night, until you can no longer tell whether you're keeping watch for the house or for yourself. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Tonight's tale fades softly, leaving its last light in the quiet corners of your mind. Let the echoes settle. Let the darkness rest. Good night.